All right, so welcome everybody to Visionality's Building Forward series. My name is Emily Barney. I'm the founder and CEO of Visionality, and I'm joined by my fearless co-host, Christiana Almeida, who's our senior project manager. And today, what are we talking about, my friend?
How to sell your amazing idea to your board.
So we came up with this topic because we keep getting this question. So we've been doing these little webinars for a hot minute now, and that kind of is like the underlying question in all of these. Okay, these are cool ideas, these are interesting, these are things we've wanted to try for a while, but how the heck do I sell it to my board? So
we're going to do this in 25 minutes.
So
timer's going.
Timer's going.
Perfect.
Christiana, how the heck do I sell this to my board?
That's a good question. So I'll admit that, like, in another life ahead of this one, I have two goals. I would like to either be a social psychologist or behavioral economics. I really like to use the social psychology aspect when it comes to selling to boards. There's an author or a psychologist that I really like to follow. His name is Jonathan Haidt, Haidt. He's written quite a few books. However, like, I was really introduced to his work through Chip and Dan Heath and their book Switch. So Switch really starts to talk about like organizational change, as a like how to make change happen at a large scale. I like basically the concept that Jonathan Haidt had come up with is creating change that is going to last involves an elephant, a rider, and a path. So the elephant is kind of like our emotional brain. The rider is the very logical brain, and the path is the thing that we're trying to accomplish. So in this instance of trying to sell something to your board, you are the writer. You have thought through this thing that you want to sell to your board. You have thought through like all the benefits. Like you've got this in your head of like, this is exactly what the organization needs. We're going to be so much better for it. The elephant, as you can guess in this possible scenario, is the board. They're a little more emotional. And I'm using the term emotional not from like a negative standpoint, but they tend to have like more like a knee-jerk reaction versus like an analytical reaction of like, this won't work or this will work. It's a more like a fast-paced like yes, no versus the thought through process of that. And the path is how you actually get the elephant and the rider to move together towards that goal. So when we start thinking through like what this actually means and starting to move this into action, so as we start to think about how to coach the rider, if we're standing watching this situation from an outside perspective, the rider needs to have an idea of like what it is that they want and why they want it. And so that's where having like KPIs is actually really important, because you're then going to need to measure whether or not the thing that you're trying is useful. And we'll talk about KPIs in a minute or two here.
KPIs, key performance indicators.
That one. The next thing that we need to do is that we need to use the rider. The rider then needs to like motivate the elephant, because if you look at the size of a rider, like how big you are versus how big an elephant is, the elephant's got 6 tons of weight on it. You've got maybe 160 pounds of weight. And so there's definitely like a very big power imbalance within that relationship. And so you're not going to be able to force the elephant, whether you shove the elephant, pull the elephant, like coax you have to coax the elephant. So you have to like relate to its emotional side. And the elephant is the classic, like, what's in it for me, scenario. So you need to be direct. You need to be coaxing that elephant and inspiring that elephant, because you need to tell it what's in it for them. What are the kind of like more emotional kind of connection points to helping that change happen? And then also like cheerleading every step of the way that, yes, that step forward was a great step forward. Oh, that second step forward was so awesome. Look at you go. This third step, look at the KPIs that now like, so celebrate every success of the elephant as the rider versus having an I told you so mentality. And then the last part of this scenario is to shape the path. So as that elephant starts to move in conjunction with the rider, how can you clear the junk off of the path, or how can you get to, you know, the end goal a little like faster and easier? Like, can you move things out of the way so that the elephant doesn't get hung up on things, you know, as it's moving forward? And so that's kind of the framework that we always like to use when it comes to selling to boards, or when it comes to, you know, just kind of creating like lasting organizational change in general. And I always have this great personal example. Many years ago, when I was just a young fundraiser, starting out, and Twitter and Facebook were new, Instagram didn't even exist. I had pitched to my board that we needed to have a Facebook account for our organization, like a Facebook and Twitter account. And the pushback was hilarious. In hindsight, it was hilarious. In the moment, it made sense. It was the only kids use these, like, you know, use these platforms. What on earth are we going to use it for? And so the way that I had tried to connect to my elephant in that instance was that we were a disaster response organization. I worked for the American Red Cross. And I was like, as a disaster response organization, one of our primary goals, or one of our primary responsibilities, is to deliver timely, useful, like, information to the public, especially during times of disaster, so that, you know, people who are following us can get information on where to go to shelters, where to, like, what should be in their disaster supply kit, without necessarily having to wait for the media to report those things. And so I said, let's look at it this way, like, because we were so young, and because because hardly anybody in Santa Barbara was using Facebook and Twitter. And so the way that I had pitched it, I'd also said, like, but it also puts us, like, as innovative and ahead of all these other nonprofits, as also a way for us to showcase the work that we're doing on a daily basis in a way that any other organization's not doing right now in Santa Barbara. So they're like, okay, let's give it 6 months and let's see kind of like what that return on investment is. So we'll see, like, how people, like, what the content is. We'll see what the followers are, because for some, like, not for some reason, followers was kind of a big metric when you're first starting out on social media. Engagement is now like the big metric, but then it was followers. And so I had started the program, we were rolling, I was posting on a daily basis, and lo and behold, the Tea Fire broke out in Santa Barbara. And so I remember we were in the middle of a board meeting when the Tea Fire broke out, and I started, you know, as soon as our director of disaster response came in and said, hey, we're opening a shelter here, I tweeted it immediately, and I posted it to our Facebook page. And I said, if you're in an evacuation warning zone, here's a link to items that you should have ready to go. So I just started posting of, like, relevant, timely information that was going to be useful to our audience. And by the next morning, we were getting calls from CNN for interviews. We were on national television very regularly. And because I was the only person on the ground that was really using Twitter and Facebook, you know, even more than our local PIOs, fire departments, et cetera, like, they felt that the Red Cross was the trusted name for information as it pertained to this disaster. And so granted, like, that was a very kind of like flash in the pan, like very kind of specific opportunity that came up that won't necessarily come up with, like, most other organizations, but it was able to kind of have that opportunity to prove, again, like, we wanted to provide relevant, timely information to our community. That had a huge payoff in the long run, and even in the short term. And we ended up, you know, hitting the KPIs of having, like, a large number of followers follow us. And so it really just kind of came to this opportunity of just, like, what's in it for the board. And, you know, the board really cares about disaster response, timeliness. They cared a lot about, like, the image of the organization, and all of those kind of fears were taken care of. And we were able to prove that having a social media program integrated into our daily operations was actually a really useful thing for that type of, you know, for that organization. And so I love this example, and I'm so grateful that I have a real life example, because, again, I was the writer. I knew exactly why we should have, you know, a social media program, but I had a board that was very hard elephant. And even, like, after, you know, I was in a PIO meeting a couple months later, and I remember a representative from a large old newspaper in Santa Barbara also kind of scolded me as being naive and thinking that social media was going to be relevant to kind of news distribution. I hope he's laughing now. I'm laughing. but it's just that opportunity of like, I was definitely the writer. The board was definitely the elephant, and then I had to use those KPIs to help shape the path and to get things out of the way so that they could see. And we did check in monthly to see what the relevancy and the usefulness of this was. So to start to bring this back to kind of like some of those nuts and bolts of how we then actually take all this storytelling aspect of it and actually start to kind of deliver the nuts and bolts of that. So we kind of wanted to start with, we're going to go through 3 items now. We're going to go through directing the writer, motivating the elephant, and shaping the path, in a little more detail. So because the writer is that analytical brain, like that is the one that measures, it's the one that looks for patterns, it's the one that researches, it's like very thoughtful, very kind of like on it. And so I want Emily to talk about like, what are good KPIs, key performance indicators, generally, regardless of the type of program, but how do you start talking about key performance indicators to your board, and why is that an important part of that sale process to them?
Yeah, so your girl loves a dashboard. Your girl loves an Excel spreadsheet that she can put graphs on and track data over time. So number one, you got to have data. And so this is like, I think it was our last building forward was about, no, you can't have all these sparkle shiny fundraising things if you don't have these basics nailed. Data, data, data. You must have data in order to have KPIs. I love time data. So time is money everywhere. And so it's really certainly at Visionality, but I think it's important at nonprofits as well, to know what you're spending your time on. A lot of times payroll is the #1 expenditure within an organization. So time is money. So what are you spending your time on, and what is the return on investment of that time? So we use a program called Toggle to track our time. Every second of the day is tracked, much to the chagrin of some people in this Zoom room. I don't know who it is. And so that's a great place to start. And to think about not necessarily what the end goal is, but what are the steps to achieve the end goal. So Christiana, one of your favorite things to track is not necessarily the end dollars raised. Yeah, that's a good thing to track, but what are the KPIs that lead up to money? So maybe the KPIs are followers on your social media. It could be, warm contacts in your donor database. So what are those like measurable levers that you can show to your board that they have a direct like impact on?
I also love new donors as a KPI too, especially in fundraising programs. So if you're trying to implement a new fundraising kind of like asset to your system, I always love the new donor one, because so many boards just care about dollars raised, but they're all freaking out about the size of their donor base shrinking. So having that KPI is really important. So even if you're not making a ton of money on those new donors, if you're stewarding them correctly, they will become those better donors later down the road. But new donor acquisition to me is a huge good KPI to use.
And recurring donors too.
Yeah.
Donor retention. I love donor.
I interrupted you.
That's all right. Also, I think it's useful when you're trying to sell a new idea to have a test time period. What is a reasonable test time period? You're not going to have results in a week. So what can you sell to your board of like, listen, give me this allocation of time for this reasonable period of time. And this is how we're going to measure success. So you're not saying this is going to be a success overnight, but it's like, we want to try this new thing. I want this much runway to give it a shot. And this is how we'll measure progress on our goals. And yeah, then again, track your time, make sure that those KPIs are like in line with your mission, vision, values. I know that sounds obvious, but it's not always the case. And so, really taking a step back and saying, at the core, like, what's the one thing, what's the one mission, vision, value that we want to move forward? with this, and then building those KPIs, building that dashboard to support that vision.
And I think a good kind of thing to bring up with this too is the difference between goals and KPIs. So when you're selling this to your board, don't necessarily have a hard in goal in place of like, we're going to have X done by Y. And so it's one of those things where it's like, look at what the progress scale is over time instead of like, was there a hard number or a hard goal that was or not met by the end of the by the end of the time period? Because I think that like it causes a ridiculous amount of stress on you trying to implement the program. But I think also like when you're trying things, like you don't know like what the end result is going to be. And I think that that's part of the learning process. So many organizations are afraid of like failing when they try new things, that they set this like these really weird goals instead of looking at what the KPIs are and whether or not you're moving forward with those key performance indicators. And then this actually transitions really well into how we then motivate the elephant. I love motivating the elephant because the elephant is the very like, again, it's highly reactional, highly emotional. It goes like, it has big reactions because it's a 6-ton elephant. And so what I love about finding those ways to motivate the elephant is like, this is what like this, like if you've ever read Simon Sinek's work, like it's the really start with why. Like this is where like you're going to get that elephant to start to think through that it's actually not scary to do this, because you're going to start telling the story of why it's important or how it's so beneficial to them, and how it's beneficial to the organization or how it's beneficial to the families that you're serving. And so the elephant really wants that emotional connection to that end goal. And so if you have like any data from clients that you've worked with, especially if you're a client like focused organization, or just kind of like opportunities that or just like gaps that you have seen between service delivery and, you know, kind of that community aspect, you're able to kind of paint a picture for that elephant. And that's what's going to start to get the elephant moving down the path. But again, the way the elephant is going to continue down the path are continuing to share that KPIs, you know, the KPIs and showing progress on those, but also celebrating every win that they have along the way. And I think that those are really important things. Like even if it's dumb and small and insignificant, your job as the rider, once the elephant starts moving, is to cheerlead like it's like your life depends on it. And so you're cheerleading the success of the board members as they start to adopt the, you know, any kind of like behavior changes that they need to adopt in order to allow this to, you know, to continue to move forward, or whether it's celebrating any successes that the organization is seeing as, again, the elephant starts to move down that path. So to get the elephant moving, you need to address its emotional side, and that's how you're going to sell it. But then once to keep the elephant moving and to keep it motivated to keep moving, you need to make sure that you're celebrating those successes and showing how those successes go back to kind of that emotional aspect that got them moving to start with. And then the last one, the last aspect of this is shaping the path. So it's, you know, doing the debris removal. It's, you know, kind of making sure that there's lights on the runway type thing. You want the elephant as it's moving to see where it's starting to go, but also to make it very easy to move down that path as well. So for example, I wish I had some really great examples of this, you know, on top of my head. But for instance, like it might mean that there's a little more lift for you as an individual to kind of help shape the behavior for the board. In case like you have to like step up and help them with a couple of things, but it also, again, it helps them because if they feel like the workload is over the top for them, they won't do it. But if you help them a little bit and then start to like back off the help as you start to train them up on certain things, they'll feel confident in their ability to do it. And then they will see that it's not that hard to do. So that's how you're able to start to clear the path for them as well, is to like get the shrubs off to the side, get the rocks out. It's like, it's actually make it very easy for them to move down that path and continue moving down that path once you get going.
And I feel like the cornerstone of clearing the path is defining roles. Like, what is the role of the board, or what are the different roles within the board? What's the role of staff? What's the role of the executive director? So talk to me a little bit about how you start to define roles and lanes and responsibilities between staff and board and leadership and all that stuff.
This is like one of my favorite exercises that I've done during board retreats. I call it lanes, like figuring out what your lane is. And so we start with the executive director, actually. So it's kind of like they're kind of the middle of the spectrum. And so what is the executive director's role in this change that nobody else gets to touch? So and then what is the staff's role in this change that the executive director is not going to touch and that a volunteer is not going to touch? And then what's a volunteer's role in this that, again, you know, looking up that the staff member is not going to touch? And then you look at the board last. So the board then, because the lift has been taken by the executive director, the staff, and the volunteers, so that the board really only sees that their kind of part in doing the lift, like their lane in the lift, is actually really small and very manageable. So it's a way to showcase to them that the organization has it taken care of. Between the executive director, staff, and volunteers, they actually have 95% of the work covered to implement this change. The board's lane is just over here now. And I love doing this, you know, the lane exercise generally, regardless of what the change is, because it sometimes when the board, especially during board retreats, when boards start talking about like implementing new programs or how to make change, the board often feels like it's their sole responsibility to actually do this. And then they get overwhelmed and then they burn out and then the change never actually happens. And so if you do the lane exercise, I always like to start with the executive director, work my way down, and then finish with the board. It helps them visualize exactly like what their role is, what their lane is in making this success happen. And it makes them more likely to actually follow through with any of the work that they're supposed to do as well. It also prevents your board from meddling in your staff's work as well, which is another kind of big thing we see happen when organizations try to implement large scale change, is that the board will often tell the staff what to do or how to do it instead of allowing the staff to actually own that lane because they have the skills to do so. But the board thinks they're being helpful, but then there's this lane in between that they're hopping over of the executive director. So usually if I'm in a group setting with a board for a retreat, I love doing these lanes as we start to talk about organizational change, because it helps the board see that they're just there to give direction and consent to the executive director. The executive director is there to report KPIs to the board. And it helps the board kind of like feel good about that change and what the reporting mechanism is for that. 3 minutes to go. Closing thoughts? Feelings?
So one thing that I want to talk about briefly, you know, it's been a trend, which is wild for a while now, that it's important to have 100% board donation. Any level, you know, we don't like give or gets. We don't like, you know, a minimum board contribution because it reduces diversity on your board and equity and access. So what we like to say is we need 100% board donation, and it needs to be at a level that's meaningful to you. The thing I want to start seeing is 100% board volunteerism. And I feel like, you know, staff on organizations, they know what's best for your clients, for whoever you're serving within your organization. They know what's best because they're dealing with your constituents day in, day out. And the only way to get the board to really deeply understand either the gaps or the successes is to get them walking the walk alongside with your staff. And so it's been really interesting taking a step back and seeing how little often board members are actually working directly with the population that the organizations serve. And I say that as like a guilty board member, because like, oh, I show up to my board meetings, that's my volunteer time, but that is not like reconnecting and grounding my board service with the actual goal of the organization, which is to help, to serve somebody.
Yeah, and I think it also helps give boards a new perspective on those lanes as well, because if they're seeing those lanes in action, like they have a better sense that they actually don't need to be doing a lot of this work as well, because they can go do the volunteer work and feel good about it and have and again, continue to have that emotional feedback to keep them motivated moving down the road of change versus siloing all of these lanes, you know, altogether. And so I think it's important, you know, from that aspect of like, giving a board member, again, like it's a volunteer role versus like I'm going to tell you what to do role as a volunteer. That putting those board members on the other end of the spectrum as a volunteer really helps them give kind of like a different perspective of how those lanes work. And I think it helps them see how those lanes work in a super important way that they are not going to see if they only go to board meetings. Okay, we got 45 seconds at this point before we wrap up. If you start to have questions, go ahead and drop them into the chat box. We'll address them after this. But just kind of like our closing thoughts is that change is very hard. Like even if it's positive change is really hard. You know, coming out of a negative change is really hard. But if you just start to think through like what the framework is to make change in an organization, and you give yourself the time, space, and grace in order to do it, like you will probably find that you're able to try to get a couple pitches in front of your board to make those changes that you think are going to be really good for the organization in the long term. And so with that, we're going to open it up for questions. If you have them, drop them in the chat. Like we always promise, we keep these to 25 minutes. Oh, there's my alarm. We always keep these to 25 minutes just because we know that you are all super busy humans and we respect that.
Well, and while we're waiting for some questions, I want to address the elephant in the room, if I may be so bold.
Wow.
We as consultants, and our friend Kathy's on here, and there are a couple other consultants, we share this magical space where we get to come in and direct the elephant in the same way often that staff has been directing the elephant, but then magically, because the consultant says it, then magically the board does it. So just know that that's true. And I'm sorry that's true, but it is true. And so think too, if there's an opportunity to partner with a consulting agency, or like if there might be like some outside education that you could offer to your board to help, you know, to have that outsider perspective to support what you're already saying. So there's a real opportunity there to get other outside examples to say what we're proposing actually isn't crazy. It's not, you know, it may be not new. Here are some other organizations who have implemented similar things and here's their successes. So just put that tool in your toolkit of directing the rider. Who is the outside source or a similar organization across the country that's doing something like what you're proposing and what their results have been?
Yeah, boards really kind of thrive on some FOMO.
Sure do.
Like, oh, so-and-so organization's doing that? Well, we should do that. Like,
why haven't we done that yet? Why haven't we done that?
Director of development sitting there like slamming their head on a desk because they're like, I've been telling you this for 4 years. Yeah, it is kind of this weird relationship that consultants, you know, own from the standpoint. I always kind of refer to it as marriage. You know, your spouse says something to you over and over and over and over again, and suddenly you have lunch with your girlfriend, you come home and you're like, oh my God, Sally said, and then all of a sudden your spouse is just like, are you for real? Like, I've been saying this for 2 years. But for some reason, sometimes it's just the delivery, like who's delivering the message, you know, that matters. And as consultants, like we find that 9 times out of 10, like the staff knows exactly what to do. They just need somebody out front to go get hit by the bus for them to the board, and that's fine. Don't mind my assistant.
All right. I see no questions, my friend. I think we've done it.
I think we nailed it.
Just like that. All right. We'll see y'all in 2 weeks. Do you?
Hold on, girl. We got to pitch something really quick.
Yeah.
I know. So Visionality is turning 10 next month. I know. Emily has kept this ship afloat through storms, droughts,
fires.
And so we are actually going to be celebrating 10 years next month, and we hope that you'll join us on October 13th for a slightly different building forward. We're actually going to do a panel discussion on the future of philanthropy. And the fun part is that we're going to have kind of like the younger faces of our sector kind of talking about like their positions and where they think the sector should be going. And so that should be a really great discussion. And we'll also have a little bit of opportunity to just kind of hear from Emily, like what she's learned over the past 10 years of owning a business that has somehow survived like economic collapses, disasters, and who knows what else. But thank you guys so much for joining us today. We hope you'll definitely join us for October 13th. It'll be at a lunchtime meeting instead of our 10 o'clock, but we'll be sending some information out on that in the very near future. Other than that, when we send out the follow-up email for this, we will have links to all of the books that we mentioned today. Go support your local bookstore and go buy those books. Like, don't buy them off of Amazon. Otherwise, we have cops coming by, so
Awesome.
I'm going to mute and sign off there.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us today. Have a good one.
Friends.